The state of Alaska is considered one of the most violent states in the country. The state also has the highest number of missing Indigenous people, according to the National Missing and Unidentified Person System. Grassroots advocates from American Indian and Alaska Native tribes calling for justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women have finally started gaining national attention. In fact, after years of grassroots advocacy, in October 2020, Congress passed Savanna's Act. Savanna's Act is meant to improve the response to missing and murdered Indigenous women across federal, state, tribal, and local law enforcement agencies. On this episode of Speaking Our Truth, Podcast for Change, we will talk about the current status of Savanna's Act and what this legislation means for our Alaska Native sisters. Hello and yate, everyone. Welcome to Speaking Our Truth, Podcast for Change by the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. I am your host, Mallory Adamski, and I am Dene. I'm so excited to be here with you today, sending prayers out to all of you. We're thinking of you and just wanting to send some good medicine out to everyone. I'm eager to introduce our guest with us today, but before we get started, let's hear a quick word from NIWRC.
The NIWRC provides culturally grounded webinars to lift up the collective voices of grassroots advocates working to end violence against Native women. Sign up for upcoming webinars at niwrc.org/events.
Now, I want to introduce our guest and sister with me here today, Michelle Demert. Michelle is a citizen of the Tlingit and Haida tribes. She is the Law and Policy Director for the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. Michelle has an article in the February 2022 edition of Restoration magazine, and the article focuses on Savanna's Act and what it means for Alaska. Today, she's sharing with us what's at stake for our Alaska sisters. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Now, Michelle, I'm hoping we can start with some background and really just some basics on Savanna's Act. Can you tell us what Savanna's Act is, its purpose, and what it directs federal agencies and law enforcement to do?
Savanna's Act is named to honor the life of Savanna LaFontaine Greywind, who was a 22-year-old pregnant citizen of the Spirit Lake Nation in North Dakota. She was viciously murdered in 2017. Savanna's Act directs the U.S. Department of Justice, or DOJ as we like to say, to review, revise, and develop law enforcement and justice protocols to address missing and murdered Indigenous peoples and aims to improve the MMIW data collection and tribal access to such data.
Right, thank you for that. And prayers and thoughts go out to Savanna's family. I know this is something that has really shaken a lot of tribal communities. So I just really want to put, some prayers up for Savanna's family.
Yeah, I agree. Prayers to Savanna's family and to all of those who have had family members go missing or have been violently murdered. It's just something that is sort of a fact of our Indigenous lives, and it's really tragic and provides a lot of trauma built on our historical trauma that we already have from hundreds of years of contact with the federal government.
I'm trying to wrap my head around how this plays out in Alaska. As some of us know, but not everyone, tribal jurisdiction is a little unique when it comes to Alaska Native tribes. In the context of Savanna's Act, how is tribal jurisdiction in Alaska different? And what does Savanna's Act mean for our Alaska sisters?
Yeah, this is a very good question, Mallory, and it's a very complicated question. I will try my best to keep it in lay terms, but I hope your audience will bear with me. In Alaska, the last frontier, justice is slow, and too often there is no justice or accountability for those who commit violence against American Indian or Alaska Native women. The situation in Alaska is different from all of Indian country, what we like to call the lower 48, because Alaska tribes have no treaties, which often define important governmental authority and territorial jurisdiction. So, why is that? Why don't we have any treaties? Well, the Alaska Territory was purchased by the United States from Russia in 1867. 3 short years later, Congress prohibited the president from treating with tribal governments. Alaska was a territory for almost a century until becoming a state during a time known as the termination era of federal Indian policy, which was about the mid 1940s to mid 1960s. Also, public law, which is 83-280, was enacted in 1953 and which was, of course, during the termination era. And what that did, it transferred to certain states federal criminal jurisdiction over Indians living on tribal lands. Before Public Law 280 was enacted, the federal and tribal governments shared jurisdiction, exclusive of the states, over almost all civil and criminal matters involving Indians on tribal lands. A month after Alaska became a state in 1958, the provisions of Public Law 280 were extended to Alaska as a mandatory state. There are 5 other mandatory states. So with Public Law 280 during the termination era, and then a unique law called the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, enacted in 1972, the situation in Alaska was created very differently because unlike most court systems that have defined territorial jurisdiction and personal jurisdiction, Alaska tribal courts generally exercise jurisdiction through tribal citizenship and not through a geographic space defined as Indian country. This is due to the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act and in part to a decision by the Supreme Court called the Alaska versus the Native Village of Venati, which was in 1998, in which a case in which the U.S. Supreme Court held that with the exception of the Annette Island Reservation, there was virtually no Indian country in Alaska. So let me pause there for a second on the timeline. So you have 1958 Public Law 280, oil was discovered, and the land situation in Alaska needed to be dealt with because Indigenous peoples had claim to so much of the land where rich oil reserves were found. And so rather than treating, which they had given up that process, as I indicated in 1871, the feds decided that they would do something unique in Alaska, and they contacted these corporation professors to help them craft a unique situation to cover Alaska, which became the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which essentially transferred all of the Indian lands from a tribe to a state-created Alaska Native Corporation. There are 13 regional corporations in Alaska, actually 12, but one is for the outside natives and who are considered landless. And within each region, village corporations were created. And so we have this complex legal structure of state-created corporations that received all tribal lands and regional corporations that received all tribal lands. When ANCSCO was created in 1993, the status of Indian tribes in Alaska was uncertain. Everyone was focused on the corporations and having access to the rich reserves that we had in oil, minerals, trees, and tribes had to learn how to be for-profit decision makers and had fiduciary duties to create profits for their corporate shareholders. So it wasn't until 1993 when the Secretary of Interior, Solicitor's Department, issued an opinion that the Alaska tribes were still in existence. So with that, that meant that Alaska tribes had governmental authority, but they had no land in which to sort of exercise that authority given the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. So, and as we know, Indian country is defined by a confined area of territorial jurisdiction tied to a tribe. Well, federal programs have expanded their definitions for Alaska Native tribes to take advantage of most programs as quote unquote dependent Indian nations. The lack of true legally defined Indian country and corresponding defined jurisdiction continues to create a dangerous situation in Alaska and for tribal governments to protect their women and children. Essentially, the state of Alaska is responsible because of Public Law 280 to provide law enforcement and other court-related services, but they've really failed to do that.
So, Michelle, let's take a moment to talk about your article in the February 2022 Restoration magazine. In the article, you mentioned that Alaska Native survivors really don't have a lot of options when reaching out for help. In fact, Alaska Native communities and villages, there are few shelters, few sexual assault services. Law enforcement is few and far between, and there's very few medical and mental health services to help with prevention and to support victim survivors. How does this play into the spectrum of violence that Native women face in Alaska, and particularly in the context of Savanna's Act and its intent to address the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women?
Yeah, thank you. Again, complicated because of the situation in Alaska. It's really important to note that the Tribal Law and Order Commission issued a report in 2014 and dedicated a chapter to the situation in Alaska because it was just so dire and so unbelievable. 40% of our villages have no law enforcement at all. So that means that if something happens, who do they call? Well, first of all, we need to point out that our children are our first responders. So our children are the ones that are trying to save mother, father, whoever is being victimized. And then who comes to their rescue? Tribal leaders or advocates. And these people are trying to stop violence and trying to protect someone. And so as a result, if something happens, like for instance, if someone actually dies and it's a murder, they're not thinking about preservation of a crime scene. They're thinking about trying to save that person's life and do whatever they can. But I mean, it's a really hard situation to be in if you're in rural Alaska, in our homelands. But we love our way of life. We love our subsistence way of life. This is where we've been for thousands of years, and so we stay there and try to adapt as we always do. But sadly, our statistics are just horrible. As of August 2021, out of the 743 missing American Indian and Alaska Native people in the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, otherwise known as NAMUS, 292 of those people were from Alaska. Why has the state of Alaska not worked with Alaska tribes to address this injustice? I mean, that is just unbelievable. For a population of Alaska to have the highest number of missing Indigenous people. And the next closest state is under 100 people, which is also, just really horrible. But the rate of missing individuals in Alaska is just ridiculous. How will Savanna's Act change Alaska's approach? Very good question. These are questions that those of us who work with survivors, their families, and tribal communities grapple with to ensure we are not giving false expectations with new programs and laws. But, I also don't want to just blame the state either, because there are some really hardworking, dedicated individuals in the state government who work really well with tribes and do their best, but they're limited in what they can do as well. So it really boils down to the state legislature, the governor's office. They have no consistent Indian policy. It just sort of, whoever's in office gets to determine what their priorities are and how they implement them. So while Alaska tribes and other tribes located in PL 280 states often lack the necessary resources, the development of tribal plans may be a way for the tribes to take advantage of this important law, Savanna's Act, right? That's one provision within Savanna's Act that that tribes can develop their own plans for how to address this. But tribes can't do that unless the federal government quickly provides the necessary resources to make this law meaningful and realize the changes that Native women and tribal communities need is something to be prioritized, and we cannot wait any longer. One final point on this is that we do have an MMIP coordinator in Alaska, and she's doing an amazing job. She's working hard with tribes, she's working with the U.S. Attorney's Office, but unless the state of Alaska asks for help, they cannot help with investigations because of this PL 280 status. And so last count, the state of Alaska had only asked for help twice in these cases. And so there's a real imbalance of power there and who is able to request help. One idea is that tribes, as tribal governments, should be able to request that the FBI or the U.S. Attorney comes in to investigate these crimes. But again, that's something that has to be sort of vetted a little bit and looked at in terms of how that would happen and how do you address the conflicts with the state law enforcement, since they weren't the ones that requested assistance.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for sharing that. It's, as you mentioned before, it's very complicated. And on that note, sort of thinking ahead and just knowing there are probably people listening who want to help, who want to be more involved, and advocate for Alaska Native women. How can people be more involved, or how can people connect with you about issues in Alaska? What's the best way to get involved with the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So we created a community action plan for MMIW issues, and we strongly suggest that communities come together, talk about these issues prior to someone going missing or being murdered, so that there's a plan to put into place immediately if some tragedy like that happens. Also, we host a monthly call the first Friday of every month at 11 a.m. Alaska time. We have an MMIW and policy call. It's open to anyone who wants to call, and I create an agenda, but it's really, we also let it be fluid in terms of who's on the call as to what we discuss, because we've had people who have had survivors of, or surviving family members, I should say, of a murder call in and request assistance with, the legal process. Not that we provide any legal assistance or support. We did work with them to raise awareness as to their murdered sister and the case that was being tried, and just sort of calling out again the need for action. So that's one way. Join our mailing list for updates and action alerts. We do a lot of training. We provide newsletters. We work with the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. We work with the National Congress of American Indians VAWA Task Force and other organizations to put together sort of national plans and reach out to, if you're in Alaska, we provide technical assistance for communities and tribes to put together their own plans. Call us, email us. And of course, I know NIWRC also provides technical assistance. So there's that avenue as well.
Well, again, Michelle, thank you so much for talking about Savanna's Act with us and really unpacking what it means for our Alaska sisters. We truly appreciate you for sharing your knowledge and your perspectives on Alaska Native issues with us today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure to talk with you today, Mallory, and I really appreciate the invite to share these important issues that we face in Alaska. Gunesh Chish, ho ho. Thank you very much.
Thank you. For everyone listening, please make sure to visit the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center online. You can find their website at aknwrc.org. And for those listening who want to read Michelle's article in the February 2022 edition of Restoration Magazine, you can find all of the articles, all of the past editions at niwrc.org/restoration. I am your host, Mallory Adamski with NIWRC. You can listen to more episodes of Speaking Our Truth, Podcast for Change, online at niwrc.org/podcast. To everyone out there listening, thank you for tuning in. Take care, everyone.